All right, Crim 11, here we go. Chapter 1, Adolescence and Delinquency. So, first and foremost, I think it's really important that we're all on the same page and we understand what juvenile delinquency actually means. So, obviously there's two words, juvenile and delinquency. A juvenile in the state of California. When we're talking about a juvenile in California, we are referring to someone who is under the age of 18. Not 18 and under, but under the age of 18. So like at midnight, 12:01 a.m. on your 18th birthday, you are no longer a juvenile. So that's who we're referring to when we're talking about a juvenile. And delinquency. What is delinquency? You probably know, but just to be clear, it's when a juvenile commits a crime or an unlawful act. So basically we are talking about young people under the age of 18 who commit crimes. So again, you probably knew that, but always best to be sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about a juvenile delinquent. So adolescence, I'm going to kind of skip over the objectives and talk about the whole concept of adolescence. Adolescence is a relatively new concept. Term didn't even exist prior to the 1930s. This is something I would kind of compare it with the whole concept of a tween. So we're talking about someone between about 12 and about 18 years of age. They're not little kids, but they're certainly not adults yet. Before the 1930s, whether you were 12 or 35, you were treated the same way if you committed a criminal act. So if I were a 12-year-old in the 1920s and I robbed a bank, and I were a 32-year-old in the 1920s and I robbed a bank, we would have been treated exactly the same because there was no separate court system. There was no separation between the way a juvenile was treated in the criminal justice system and an adult. During the 1930s, my grandpa, for example, when he was a child, when he was going to high school even, he would work all night at his family's diner, and he would go to school all day. And that was kind of typical. It was normal. Everybody did that, if they went to school at all. So the whole concept of that adolescence is relatively new, something that we haven't always had in the United States. Okay, we already talked about this. Juvenile delinquency, an act committed by a minor that violates the penal code of the government with authority over the area in which the act occurs. So a juvenile is a young person under 18 who commits a crime. We've kind of seen, this is kind of the path through time. Like I said, the concept of how children are treated now is very different than it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was normal for children to work. And I'm not talking, they would work part-time after school, do 2 hours at Starbucks after school. No, they were working to help support the family. Little by little, things started to change, and it became mandatory for young people to attend school. About the 1960s-ish, children's rights movements, people were realizing that children needed to be treated differently in court, in the criminal justice system than adults. And then there are now quite a few legal protections for juveniles, and trust me, we're going to go all into that later on in this course. But again, talking about past behavior, what a child was in the past versus what a child is now. You can read the PowerPoint. You don't need me to read it all for you. But children were treated like small adults. They were expected to work. Education wasn't important. Girls just got married and had babies and took care of their families. That whole emotional bond with the child was different back then. It kind of feels like we may have gone too far the other way now, and myself included. But anyways, children were punished as adults, and they had few rights. And you know how children behave now. So these are some differences. What are some high-risk behaviors? problem behaviors leading to delinquency. This is not rocket science. You're going to look at all this and go, of course. School problems, yes. If someone doesn't do well in school, are they more likely to become delinquent? Yeah, they are, because when they go to school, imagine every day you go to school and you feel like you have no idea what you're doing. Your confidence level is going to be low. You're not going to want to go to school. You're not known for doing anything positive at school. Maybe you want to be known for being the biggest badass at school, or you want to be the one who's the best fighter at school, or the one who sells the most drugs at school. So school problems, definitely. Gang involvement, of course, obviously would lead to delinquency. Mental health issues can definitely lead to delinquency. Family problems, we're going to get very deep into this stuff. Sexual activity and drug use and sales. So again, I'm probably not telling you anything that you didn't already know about that. Oh, there's a funny slide in here that says that high-risk behavior for juveniles includes not wearing your seatbelt. It's not on this slide, but I think that's quite the rebel. But anyways, high-risk juveniles usually have multiple issues. So maybe they're not good in school. They've got issues at home. They have mental health issues. They have all of it going on at the same time. So that obviously can add to here it is, not wearing a seatbelt. Anyways, you should wear your seatbelt. I'm just saying. I just don't know that that's considered high-risk behavior that would make someone become a delinquent. But anyways, but these are some other high-risk behaviors. Parens patriae. Okay, this is going to be something that is important for you to know throughout this course, and probably certainly if you want to work in the world of probation, but even as a police officer, a correctional officer, any of those types of things, the concept of parens patriae is important. Ultimately, early on, the King of England decided that certain parents weren't taking care of their children properly. So he made an order and said, I, the king, am now going to step in and make decisions on behalf of this child because the parent isn't doing their job. We still use this kind of concept now in our juvenile courts here in the United States, specifically in California. So parens patriae ultimately now during current times basically means the government, or basically the judge, court, gets to step in and take over as the parent because maybe the parent isn't quite taking care of business. The way I remember this, and I teach my students to remember this, but don't use this with other instructors, but with me, I say the court is your daddy. Hopefully you're going to remember it forever and ever, because parens patriae and the court is your daddy is going to stick in your head, and you're going to say that. Remember that stupid phrase Fernandez said? So anyways, that's what it is. It's when the court gets to step in and take the role as a parent. I'm going to kind of skip over this one because I don't like that they are talking about this. Anyways, delinquency. We've already talked about, let's go up here, juvenile courts. There are two kinds of courts in the juvenile world. One is a delinquency court, like we see here. And we already talked about what a juvenile delinquent is. It's a juvenile that's broken the law. Okay. Then we have dependency court. This is a court that basically is stepping in when a child either doesn't have a parent or doesn't have a suitable parent. I consider this more like a CPS court. You know, if you think of Child Protective Services. So these are the kids that are being removed from their parents. So you have the two courts, delinquency and dependency, and they deal with different types of issues, as you can imagine. Sometimes there's some crossover. If a child is abused and neglected in the home, they're probably more likely to end up in delinquency court eventually, but these are two different courts that deal with two different issues. Okay, a status offense, you see right here, is an offense that is only illegal because of your age. It is only illegal because of your age. So let me give you an example because I think this helps it make more sense. Imagine it is 2 o'clock in the morning and I, 40-something-year-old woman, is walking down the street by myself at 2 in the morning and Fresno PD rolls up on me. Is there a problem? No. I'm just some random 40-something-year-old woman walking down the street by myself at 2 in the morning. No big deal. Let's say my 12-year-old daughter is walking up and down the street at 2 a.m. and Fresno PD rolls up on her. Is there a problem? Yeah, there's a problem. That's a status offense. It's only illegal because she is under 18. All right, so status offense. Running away, truancy, underage drinking, curfew violations. This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about when we talk about a status offense. It's only illegal because of their age. This is something, a concept that we're going to hear a lot about. Why do status offenders do what they do? Parents seem to be a real common answer. Should status offenders be separate from juvenile delinquents in juvenile hall? Think about it. A kid who is out past curfew, should that kid be housed in the same facility as a kid who has stabbed somebody? I can tell you the answer to that. We do not house them at all anymore. Status offenders are not kept in custody in the state of California. We simply don't have room for them. And ultimately, I think the decision was made because we didn't want to have status offenders, low-level offenders, mixed with our more high-level offenders. So that did not happen, though, until 1974. So before 1974, if you ran away from home, you'd go to juvenile hall. If you run away from home now and the police come and pick you up, they're just taking you home. Should the juvenile court have jurisdiction over status offenders? They do not right now in California. I'm just gonna tell you that. We have decriminalized status offenses in California. So child welfare system versus juvenile justice system. This is where you would consider dependency court. This, delinquency court. Okay. Crossover youth. Again, can you imagine, I'm going to go back here. Can you imagine, and this happened to me on quite a few occasions, a kid who is abused and neglected at home. Maybe he's placed in a group home or a foster home. He's still more likely to break the law and end up over here. Makes sense? A lot of youth will start out over here because they've had some really traumatic experiences at home, and then they end up in the juvenile justice system. So I dealt with a lot of youth who'd been removed from their home and then committed a crime, and then they ended up on probation with me. So that's what we call that crossover youth. Pretty common, as you can imagine. This is kind of the path to the juveniles' rights from the colonial period until now. So we kind of touched on this, but you can imagine young people, very young, they were, not young, a long time ago, they were housed with adults. Then the Quakers came to the United States and said, I really think that maybe we should separate juveniles and adults. So we started with the juvenile courts era, the juvenile rights era, reform agenda era, social control and juvenile crime era. Anyways, we're going to talk about all this stuff eventually. Social control and structural conditions. Delinquent behavior, pretty much all of our behavior takes place in a social context. So do we learn delinquent behavior? Probably. Who do we learn it from? We can learn it from a whole bunch of different places. I'm going to kind of skip through this really quick. Social policy is another issue that comes up quite a bit when we're talking about juveniles. I use the example as a probation officer when I worked at Hoover High School. I can tell you with certainty that I had probably out of hundreds of children that I supervised on probation, I would say 2 of them played sports. Okay, so is there a haves or have-nots when we're considering high school sports? And a lot of you are probably shaking your head right now. Yes, if you're not a good enough athlete, then is it possible that you might not make the team? If you haven't been playing that sport since you were 5 years old, is it more likely that you won't be? Exactly. Yes, my husband is agreeing with me. Money. What about money? Yeah.
Sports.
Yeah, I know. So he says money, money, money. Yeah, exactly. So social policy, meaning that not every kid can afford, not every kid's parents can afford to put them in club sports when they're 5 years old. Does that make that kid? Is there a level playing ground then? No, there's not a level playing ground. I think we all know this, but this is what we're talking about when we're talking about society and how society works. Of course not. There's not a level playing field, and it sucks. It's true, but it does suck still. Oh my gosh, we did not already go through all that. So, I'm sorry, yeah. And then my husband is here too, and I was talking, obviously, he heard me lecturing, and total agreement, keeping your kids busy, keeping them in sports, can really help. But if you can't afford to do that, it's significant. So anyways, I think we actually just wrapped up chapter 1. Looks good. All right, tomorrow, chapter 2.